You're listening to Alt-Right Radio, the official podcast of AlternativeRight.com, an online magazine of radical traditionalism. Here is your host, Richard Spencer.
Hello, everyone. Today it's so good to have with us Dr. Kevin MacDonald. Kevin is a professor of psychology at California State University, Long Beach, and he's the author of numerous scholarly books and papers, including A People That Shall Not Dwell Alone, Judaism as a Group Evolutionary Strategy, Separation and Its Discontents, Towards an Evolutionary Theory of Anti-Semitism, and The Culture of Critique, an evolutionary analysis of Jewish involvement in 20th century intellectual and political movements. He also has a recently published collection of essays called Cultural Insurrections. But thanks for being with us today, Kevin.
It's great to be here.
Thanks. Well, I don't want to dwell too long on Norman Podhoretz because I think you handled his book thoroughly, as did David Gordon in his complimentary essay. But I just kind of want to use him to get at this larger issue, which is the remaking of the right, or this total transformation of American conservatism, American traditionalism, even over the 20th century. And it's your view that obviously I think it's obvious, everyone's view that the neoconservatives had a lot to do with it. It's your view that Jewish conservatives or Jewish neocons had a lot to do with it. And also, just I'll mention that Norman Podhoretz is an excellent prism to understand this issue because he, in many ways, encapsulates almost all of the directions in which American Jewish intellectuals went in the 20th century, in the sense of he started out as a kind of Trotskyist Marxist, he moved on to robust Cold War liberalism, and perhaps he never lost that last view, but he ended up as a kind of neoconservative, voting for Reagan and the Bushes and so on and so forth. But one thing, let me just get us, I'll just start out the conversation by throwing this out there. One very poignant thing you said at the beginning of your essay was that Podhoretz, for Podhoretz, his Jewishness is one of the most important aspects of his writing, if not the most important aspect. And yet he feels that he is an outsider to the Jewish community. So pick up on that in terms of that strange dialectic going on there.
Yes, that's a very prominent theme in his book, actually. He often talks about going in front of Jewish organizations and Jewish meetings and so on, and giving talks about why they should support the Republicans and so on, and getting these really stony, angry responses. They're very hostile towards him. So he feels sort of an outcast in the Jewish community. Very, very true. At the same time, he feels very Jewish. He sees himself. There's no question that it's not as if he just sees himself as a regular American. He sees himself as having a strong Jewish identity. The entire focus of the book, I think I make the point in one place that he talks about why being a Republican or a conservative would be good for Jews, and he spends 2 or 3 paragraphs. Affirmative action is not good for Jews, he says. Then he's got 160 pages on Israel, so it's clear where his real interests are. Yeah.
Right. And talk a little bit about this trajectory of someone like Norman Podhoretz, which he shared with a number of other prominent Jewish intellectuals, in the sense of starting out in Marxism, going to Cold War liberalism, ending up voting for George W. Bush. Talk a little bit about how each of those moments in his life represented something about his conception of his own Jewishness.
Yes, I got a dog here.
That's all right.
But yes, he certainly reflects the sort of general trends within the Jewish community. And he's written about this exhaustively. During the 1930s, 1940s, it was very common for the Jewish intellectual community to be very strongly on the left. And there was a split between the Trotskyists and the Stalinists that they made an awfully big deal about. And he sort of gradually moved away from that. But his book is very interesting in that regard because he shows how strong this commitment to the far left was in the Jewish community. At one point, he said that if you were on the far right of the Jewish community, you were a socialist. I mean, in other words, the sort of center of the Jewish community was somewhere to the left of socialism. And so he gradually got away from it. And it's clear that his concerns about Israel were the main motivating force that kept moving those people to be more conservative. I think originally it's because they were followers of Trotsky, and Trotsky, of course, was exiled by Stalin.
Right.
And so they had this whole this community centered around Trotsky, and they were very critical of the Soviet Union. And then the Soviet Union became, anti-Semitism in the Soviet Union became a reality. So they were very critical about the Soviet Union because of its treatment of Jews. But even then, you could see that in the 1930s and 40s, the people centered in that group were very strongly Jewish, and they saw the Soviet Union through Jewish eyes as someone as having become anti-Semitic. So that then morphed into the Cold War thing and support for Israel and so on.
Well, I think that's definitely true in the sense of a lot of Jewish intellectuals changing sides due to the enemy's relationship to Israel. Certainly, a lot of people who are on the American left with the '67 war and after would kind of shift towards the right, if that's the right word, in that situation. Why do you think the default position of so many American Jews is to be on the left in general, though?
Well, that is the big topic in his book, and the second part of my review really focuses on that. He takes the view that it's become a sort of religion that their sort of liberalism is religious, and I sort of agree with that because it's become a sort of ideology that I think is not really it's not falsifiable, sort of religious in that sense. And I also point out that I wrote the book The Cultural Critique, that Jewish intellectual movements have often been characterized by this sort of fervor and this sense of not being able to be disconfirmed by any reality or anything. But again, that does not really explain why they've become on the left, because they could have the same sort of fanaticism or whatever if they were conservative. So what I argue is that this is a part of a strategy in the diaspora. If you look at Israel, it's dominated by the far right now, and I think the only 10% of Israelis now vote for the Labor Party, and even they're not very far to the left anymore. So,
and there's not a lot of disagreement on war issues. I mean, when in the with the recent invasion of Gaza in 2008 and 2009, I mean that was the Labor and the right getting together. There seems to be, they might disagree on unemployment insurance or something, but
right, something like that. But on the basic policy towards the Palestinians, they don't, and it's basically an apartheid racialist state over there, and so you can't say that's being sort of liberal and ethnically tolerant as part of Judaism as a general characteristic. It's simply not, and so you have to see this tendency towards liberalism as being a strategy in various diaspora countries. And in general, that has been directed towards, very high levels of immigration, sort of opposed to Christianity, having sort of, public standing in America, and so on. So my view is that being on the left in America has been a part of Jewish group interests, and now what you see on the left is sort of that the Jewish groups are making all these alliances with other non-white groups, Mexicans, And so what we see is this coalition of non-white groups banding together, and certainly Jews are a big part of that. So I think they see and again, that relates to his whole view of history. And again, the first half of the book is fascinating because it's very typical of Jewish intellectuals, just completely across the political spectrum, to see Western history as one long veil of tears. That there's just one persecution after the other. And so when they look at American history, or the history of Europe, they just see Jews as having been persecuted repeatedly. And so then they see our culture, our whole civilization, as pathological and something that has to be sort of overcome. And so I think that has motivated the Jewish left, which is maybe 80 or 90% of Jews in America, in their opposition, because their voting pattern doesn't make any sense economically. I mean, they're very elite in terms of economic status, but they are voting, as the author says, they earn like Episcopalians, but they vote like Puerto Ricans. That continues to be the case, and so you can't analyze what they're doing in terms of economic situation. You have to think of it as some kind of ethnic strategy. So that's my proposal. And I try to base it on as many facts as I can.
Right. Well, do you think they do benefit by this? And I'll just say this. I mean, I agree with, and maybe I'm thinking more of what Paul Gottfried would say, and less of what Norman Podhoretz would say. But I agree that Jews have much more to gain, at least in the long term, by making alliances with traditional Americans, white Americans, what have you. In the sense that these are, the Jewish people are without question well-to-do, that they would benefit from a society that is European and Western, more stable, more economically free and economically prosperous. I mean, I think that is, most definitely true. But do you think it's a case of just the religion, or do you think that Jews, at the very least the Jewish leadership, see that they really do have something to gain by liberalism, and maybe they're completely short-sighted in that, but they do rationally see that?
Well, yeah, that's really the sort of $64 question.
Right.
I do think that you can make the argument that Jews are not behaving in their best interest at this point, especially, and the people like. Who's the guy that opposes immigration very prominently for Jews? He's made the argument, especially with Muslim immigration, it's hard to see how Jews benefit from it. But the organized Jewish community, the people who really run the community, have not changed their position. And it could be that that Podhoretz is right. That there's this sort of fervent religious commitment. The problem is that Podhoretz is committed to those same policies. He wants them to exist in the Republican Party as well as the Democratic Party. I mean, he's not opposed to immigration at all. I mean, I'm talking about Stephen Steinway. Stephen Steinway is the most prominent spokesperson among the Jews for that we should really stop this immigration thing because it's not good for Jews. And that makes a lot of sense. But again, I think the organized Jewish community sees alliances with non-white ethnic groups as the way to go. They have done this for a century.
Yes.
And they're not going to stop now. So I don't see this changing.
Let's get to the remaking of the right and something you just mentioned, which was Podhoretz's his bringing of these policies like open borders, use of the military for global revolutionary ends, and all this kind of stuff, things that you would associate with the left, and his bringing of these things into the Republican Party, the conservative movement, and all of that kind of thing. Do you think this was, one thing that you argue in your piece, that they in some ways wanted to make the Republican Party safe for the Jews, in their opinion. Do you think it's more than that? Or maybe just talk a little bit about that transformation of the conservative GOP.
Well, yeah, I think that has been a very important historical trend within the Republican Party. if you're trying to, influence American public policy towards Israel, you don't want to just be associated with one political party.
Right.
You want to be on both sides of the aisle. So it makes very good political sense for Jews to court support within the Republican Party, and that's been their goal, and they've substantially succeeded in that. But the thing is, when they've done this, their main focus has been policy towards Israel. But when it comes to various domestic policies, like critically immigration, my view of immigration is almost the only important issue that we have. And when it comes to that, they have been for open borders, and so they don't have any differences of opinion from Jews in the Democratic Party. So it's what the effect then has been to essentially move the Republican Party to the left, and that, in my view, has not been good. And so, in the article, I have a long quote from Sam Francis, because he was sort of involved in those disputes in a way I was not. He was there in the late 80s during the Reagan administration, when this transformation was really going on. And he just talks about them sort of elbowing people out, ruining their careers, casting aspersions on their character and so on. And it was a real blood fight going on there. And essentially, the old guard conservatives, people like Pat Buchanan, were moved out.
Right.
People like St. Francis were moved out, and now you have the Republican Party as we see it today. So even though the vast majority of Jews have remained loyal to the Democrats, you have this very influential group within the Republican Party that has shifted the Republican Party to the left on the critical issue like immigration.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I've always found it strange. Whenever I see movement conservative publications and things like that, they'll make it out as if the Democratic Party is this wildly anti-Semitic organization that hates Israel and loves the Palestinians. I just find this kind of stuff so bizarre. It's like they really are living in some other alternate universe.
Yeah, that was Pat Horitz's thing. He was trying to do that too, to paint the Democratic Party and liberalism as really anti-Semitic and anti-Jewish and anti-Israel and all that. But it's a joke. If you look at the voting patterns in Congress, I mean, 90% of Democrat congressmen vote for just about any pro-Israel resolution there is.
Right.
They are almost as much in the pocket of the Israel lobby as Republicans. They're not really significant difference.
Right. Actually, one other point that is worth mentioning again is this aspect of the neocons coming over to the Republican Party. There's something more than just Israel about their worldview, in the sense that they could have just left well enough alone and had a traditionally conservative, maybe even religious conservative Republican Party, but then just kind of added pro-Zionism, pro-Israel sentiments on top of it. But they didn't do that. Actually, there's a good article from the early 90s in the New York Times that's actually praising Bill Kristol. And it's basically saying how this man is so great because he's pro-life and he's pro-immigration, and he's basically some mildly right of center social democrat is the essence of this article, which the New York Times loved, of course. So they didn't do that. So even though I fully agree that that Israel is something that is extremely important for neoconservatives, there's more to it. They didn't want to just, if it was just about Israel, they could have played a game and just gotten the conservative movement on board. But there was much more to it.
Actually, that's very true. And there's a quote from Bill Kristol to the fact that we've sort of pulled the Republican Party by its hair into the 20th century or something like that. That's exactly how they see themselves. And so they have gone way beyond what they had to do and really have moved the Republican Party, as you say, very much so.
Right. Let's talk about, just to bring this conversation to a close, and I'd certainly like to have you on again to discuss this issue or others. But talk a little bit about some possible divisions in the Jewish community, because Certainly, I would imagine that there are divisions between Southern Jews and Jews in the Eastern Establishment. Certainly there are many Jews who are interested in a lot of the same causes that you and I are interested in. If you go to something like an American Renaissance conference, there are many Jews represented there. And there's probably a major difference between the Orthodox community and also the kind of more typical liberal Jew that you'll meet in other situations. So do you think there is some kind of fragmenting or some different camps, some of which might be more in line what we want within the Jewish community, or do you think that they kind of there's a solidarity there that's stronger than that?
Well, there certainly is a very large solidarity if you look at the organized Jewish community. But there are people. We talked about Stephen Steinlein, who objects to Jewish policy and immigration, and there are people like Lawrence Oster, who had the same point of view. Paul Gottfried is certainly critical of the Jewish community in a lot of ways. So there are individual Jews, and there are a few Jews that have turned up at the American Renaissance. But again, they tend to be peripheral figures, even far more so than Podhoretz. And what I have always said is that if Jews are on board with the movement to sort of remake America and to sort of bring back some of the traditional people and culture of our country and to make them primary, I would welcome them as allies, absolutely. But I just see that now. There's some fractioning. If you look at the Israel lobby, you now have J Street, which is a new player, and they are influential. They're sort of, they're certainly not as rabidly on the right as the Israel lobby, the AIPAC has been. But a lot of people are criticizing them too. That they're sort of really not they're not really all that much of an alternative to AIPAC.
I don't think so whatsoever. I've heard some people at the American Conservative talking up J Street. Scott McConnell. I find that utterly ridiculous. They seem like Me Tooism, or like we're just like AIPAC except. AIPAC with a human face or something. I mean, it just sounds there's nothing going on. I think it's pretty naive to see J Street as something. But it is true. There's certainly people like Gottfried and Oster and things like that are important components of the movement.
And there certainly are divisions within the Jewish community. You can't ever see them as totally monolithic, but you have to look where the power is. And I think sometimes Jewish apologists have tried to overemphasize how much diversity there is, because when you look at the big, powerful organizations like the ADL and AIPAC and so on, they are really on page with this pro-Israel agenda for and the organizations like the ADL very much in favor of immigration. This is where the power of the Jewish community is, and that's where the money goes. And so that's what you have to think about, too. Right.
Well, thank you, Kevin, and I would like to have you on again. So we'll do it.
We'll talk again sometime.
Okay.